Today we're talking about experiments with David Atkin, who is a professor of economics at MIT. David, welcome.
Thank you.
So let me start by asking you, how would you summarize your research on development and international trade?
In general, I use many different methodologies, but in recent years I've been using randomized control trials quite frequently to try and understand how trade and industrial policy can potentially help lift the poor out of poverty and boost growth in the developing world. And on top of that, I'm also quite interested in topics related to culture and preferences, as well as price indices, and some of my other work has fallen in those areas.
So you have quite diverse work, but as you said, you work extensively with experiments and RCTs. So in your experience, how useful are experiments and what are some of their key limitations?
I think experiments are extremely useful. I wouldn't underplay that at all. I mean, the most obviously useful benefit of experiments is if you have come up with a new policy or you want to evaluate an existing policy. There's a lot of uncertainty on how well those policies work, even if the theory behind them is very solid. And we've consistently found that when you actually evaluate these policies, many of the ones you think would be very successful aren't, and ones that you didn't think would work particularly well may be very successful. And this is true when we're thinking about poverty alleviation programs, but also true when we think about management interventions. Certain types of management interventions may be much more effective than people expect, and others may be much less effective than the literature believes. And so I think just for simply evaluating a particular policy, there's a reason they're called the gold standard. It's very difficult, as we know, to do credible policy evaluation with kind of naturally occurring data, and randomization essentially allows us to create the perfect experiment in order to tell whether those policies work or not. More generally, so that's a place where they're essential. I think more generally, just trying to build on our body of knowledge. Thinking about mechanisms, thinking about kind of underlying structures that are driving potentially these outcomes. Then experiments are also are very useful. I mean, the way I would think about it is, anytime you would like to do an empirical analysis, it's better to have truly exogenous variation, or almost any time. There are maybe some contexts where you're just looking for correlations, but you'd like to have exogenous variation, and you may try very hard to kind of come up with a natural experiment or controls or an instrumental variable strategy that you think gets you close to getting the results of that true exogenous that you get with that true exogenous variation. And so if you can bring to bear a randomization there, then you're going to be on much firmer ground. So in general, if it's possible to do so, you're going to avoid many of the pitfalls that we're now very well aware of when making inference using kind of the natural variation in the data. I'd say the third kind of benefit of experiments, and this links to a kind of this recent movement of thinking more about pre-analysis plans, is if you think about how a normal experiment works vis-a-vis normal empirical analysis, or even a structural analysis, or to some degree even a theoretical study, is you have your hands tied a lot more when you're doing an experiment, because you've had to kind of design it in advance. And particularly if you've kind of registered the design, even if you haven't, it's usually pretty obvious from the way you've designed it, kind of what questions you had in mind, how you were going to evaluate it. And that really puts a lot of restraint on kind of the kind of free parameters for the researcher to potentially manipulate. And that gives us kind of more plausible estimates. As anyone who's worked with empirical data knows, there's some specifications that work, some choices that look better than others, et cetera. And while there's still those issues to some degree in experiments, much less so than in a kind of normal empirical work. while there's a lot to be learned by exploring how your answers change when you use different variation, there's also the potential to mislead. And so, a real strength is the fact that kind of by their nature, it's harder to do that when we think about an experiment. Now, obviously, they come with big limitations as well. The most obvious one is they're difficult to run. They're often expensive to run. They often require collaborating with partners who may be relationships that may be difficult to manage in order to get them to carry through on the experiment when they may have different incentives. And that means there's only a limited number of contexts where there might be a feasible thing to do. I'm very interested in industrial policy, but it's quite hard to get countries to randomize their industrial policy. And there aren't a lot of, kind of small actors running small scale industrial policy, which may be more amenable to this. And so certain questions, you're going to have to, use other methods. And so the way I would put it is, in situations where it's easy to run an experiment or possible to run an experiment, then they're going to be very useful. In situations where that's implausible, then they're not going to be of use. So we're only able to answer certain questions. Obviously, if we only decided to answer the questions that we could do experiments and leave the other questions unanswered, there'd be a problem there. And the industrial policy example is one which I think is very relevant here. Countries are still doing industrial policy. It would still be great for economists to engage in those discussions, even if we don't have a kind of ironclad evidence for them. And so, one kind of pitfall to avoid is if there are important questions and policy decisions being made, we should still be involved in those conversations, doing the best we can. But obviously, if we can do an experiment, we should be doing an experiment. That would be how I would think about it.
So thank you, David. You touched upon a lot of very interesting points. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you mentioned. And so I guess one of them, when it comes to like when to run experiments and when to use natural experiments instead, I think thankfully there are a lot of legislation changes over time, and that they tends to be truly exogenous in the sense that nobody can sort of see them coming and nobody can do anything about them. So you have to comply with the new rules. But as you said, sometimes you don't have that natural experiment. Sometimes it's very hard to run a randomized controlled trial. And this made me think about one of the studies that you ran with a couple of co-authors, where you were looking at rug producers in Egypt, and you managed to randomize the extent to which these companies have access to foreign markets, which seems quite hard to actually do. So I was wondering how you thought about running an experiment to answer that particular question, and whether there were any challenges that you encountered as you were either designing or running that particular study.
Of course. So that was obviously an ambitious study, and we definitely encountered a lot of issues in the design. So I guess initially Amit and I, it was just after I finished grad school, and he'd been out for a year or two, and we, I guess, met at a conference, and we started talking about, this is kind of one of the big questions in trade, is what's the impact of exporting on firms, and this, is a question which would naturally fit into kind of a experimentation paradigm, and why don't we try and do it? And so we thought about, how can we actually go and randomize entry into exporting? And so our first thought was, there's a lot of programs that try and push firms into exporting, often funded by development agencies, government aid agencies, etc. And maybe we could piggyback on one of those. So we reached out to the various, implementing organizations that say USAID hires to do their projects, or DFID in the UK, etc. And looked around for many of these kind of market access projects where, whatever $3 million or $5 million was allocated to help this type of firm reach foreign markets in this particular country. Simultaneously, we were also looking at NGOs who did this. and often they would get grants from development agencies as well. And through those many different avenues, we had a couple of leads going someplace, and eventually it was a NGO, Aid to Artisans, whose job is to link a kind of small producers to global markets. And they were rolling out in Egypt, and like many NGOs or companies bidding for these types of contracts now, the kind of donors like to see some evidence of what they're doing being actually beneficial. And so they're often quite excited about the possibility of having external organization help them with their monitoring and evaluation. And so we kind of joined up with them as they rolled out kind of a new initiative in Egypt. And that's when we brought on Adam Osman, who was a PhD student at Yale at the time, where I just started. And that's when a lot of the design challenges started coming up. What exactly was their program? How exactly would we turn this into a randomized experiment looking at exporting? And eventually the way we had to do that was firstly by they were going into many different areas in Egypt, working with many different groups of producers. We kind of had investigated a few different ones before eventually realizing that the setting was good for the rugs. And then we had to be very careful to kind of keep control of our experimental design there, since there were different incentives from the kind of head office in Egypt versus the global office vis-a-vis performance targets. And we were extremely fortunate that we had a project manager who was jointly hired by us and David Atkin, who's now gone on to become one of the senior people at JPAL in the Middle East, who was passionate about experiments and was vital to ensuring that the integrity of the experiment was maintained when there was pressure to kind of boost the number of firms who were kind of pushed into exporting, so they could report that on their annual report in the Egypt team. And it was vital that we had someone on the ground making sure, reiterating the value of this experiment to the organization, to the local team who was maybe less who benefited less from this experiment going well than the global company who would get future contracts for it. So maintaining the integrity is difficult, and that involves personal relationships and keeping your eye on the ball and having good people on the ground. Then there were still many other challenges we had to face. Initially, we had to drum up orders for these rugs in order to then randomize which producers were provided with the opportunity to export by giving them essentially a trial order with the expectation that that would continue if they were successful at fulfilling the trial order. And we initially started with kind of 4 types of rugs which were made in the area we were working in, and we ultimately only managed to get orders for one of those 4 types of rugs. And so we could think of we have a separate experiment with n equals 4 where we show that it's very hard to kind of drum up foreign demand, and we were only successful in kind of 1/4 of our attempts there. And then it took a while for those orders to flow, but once they did, then things went more smoothly. I guess another big question when designing experiments is the surveys. It's maybe not the most exciting bit of the research, but creating good surveys and good measurement is really critical to the success of an experiment. And we put a lot of effort and work, and having a survey team who we could trust. Kind of our first survey team we hired from an external company, and some of them were just making up data, which we had an auditor and we caught that, and we had to kind of dismiss them. And in the end, we had to run our own survey team, hiring people full-time ourselves in order to kind of navigate these trust issues. And so those types of issues arise as well. And then piloting the surveys making sure the subjects understand the questions, understand them the way that you mean them to, understand the meaning you're intending, and making sure that the kind of questions are kind of targeted at aspects that aren't too noisy. So just as an example, we're trying to look at kind of benefits on the consumption side and even income side for these producers who were kind of shocked into exporting. And we discovered after a bunch of trial and error that it was very hard to, or time consuming to, work out a full consumption module. Income was a kind of tricky object to measure when it was their kind of own business. They were kind of a small business owner, and what exactly was their money versus the business's money that they were kind of pumping back in, et cetera, et cetera. And in the end, we found we had a very strong and unnoisy measure of at least consumption, which came from how often they ate meat, which is kind of a luxury good that they ate approximately once a month, maybe twice a month, and people had very good memories of how often they ate meat, and we saw a kind of sizable changes in the frequency of consuming meat when you were kind of shocked into exporting. So, it's possible through careful survey work to find kind of simple questions that are actually not so noisy at picking up real changes, and that's another difficult task, but one which has high returns when implementing an experiment.
Well, thank you, David. I think my two sort of key takeaways from what you shared so far is that, first of all, the devil is in the details. So, and there are a lot of things that can potentially go wrong when you're running a field experiment, especially. So I'm wondering, and this brings us to talk about pre-registration and pre-analysis plans. They're becoming more common in economics, as I understand. In your experience, how helpful are they, and how do you deal with them when things change compared to your original plan for the study?
So they're definitely becoming more common, or they were becoming more common. I think maybe there's been a bit of pushback in recent years. I think, I'm not a world expert on this, and I would refer an interested party to an excellent piece that was published by many members of the JPAL board, where they kind of evaluate pre-analysis plans. I think the big trade-offs are, we talked about earlier, it's good to kind of tie your hands on your ability to try many different specifications and pull out a conclusion that's not warranted by the data. So, if you're doing, say, a simple policy evaluation, an NGO has a program which is, I don't know, putting an extra teacher in a school, or doing a small business training on management to firms, then it makes a lot of sense to have a pretty strong pre-analysis plan. There'll be pressure maybe from the implementing partner to maybe get a result which is favorable to them, and it's clear what your goal is. I just want to try and or it's clear that one goal is to try and tell you there is a policy that people are using, or people want to use, or a government's thinking about. How well does it work? What's the cost benefit analysis you might want to do afterwards? And there, I think a pre-analysis plan is essential, and a pre-registration. Now, beyond that, there's a lot of the best work, certainly in economics, has come from seeing relationships in the data that were unexpected, and trying to understand them and learning new things about the world through that process. And we don't want to shut down that type of inference just because we're using a randomized experiment. And so, I think it's just important to try and differentiate between those two types of research. If the goal is to provide a gold standard estimate that someone's going to use to make a policy decision on what is the return to this particular program in this particular context, then you want to be using that pre-registered pre-analysis plan. If you want to better understand a particular issue, and there's something the researchers learned from the experiment that adds to our stock of knowledge, then in the same way that someone has learned something from non-experimental data and was happy to publish it even if it wasn't the first thing they looked for in the data, that's also an extremely valid form of research and should also be encouraged. These RCTs are expensive as well. So, if you've spent a long time, a lot of effort, a lot of time, a lot of money on running a randomized control trial, then it seems a shame to say that the only output can be this very narrow evaluation, and we can't do the type of research that we've been doing with non-experimental data for hundreds of years. So, I think we need to kind of balance those two, and I think we're kind of moving towards that balance. And what that means is, maybe there's a couple of key outcomes, and you're saying if we want to evaluate this policy, we should do it this way, and then maybe not tie your hands in a way that's going to lead to reviewers who maybe don't like your agenda or don't like your methodologies, to try and shoot it down, saying, oh, it wasn't pre-registered, that structural model you wrote using your randomized variation afterwards, so I'm not going to accept that. So I think we need a kind of a balance here, where there are some questions which are very amenable to having a full pre-analysis plan that very closely details the outcome. But there's also other types of work where you don't want to tie your hands, because you may end up wanting to do something quite different to what you originally intended when you discover some very interesting aspect. And we should understand that wasn't the initial goal. But it seems like we're putting experiments, we're holding them up to a standard we don't hold other econometric research. There's no reason why you also shouldn't have to pre-register my attempts to be causal, natural experiment-ish study I'm doing, or difference in difference study, and you could obviously pre-register that, say this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to run this, I haven't seen the data yet, no one's given me the data, and then someone gives you the data, and then you have to follow exactly that pre-analysis plan. Do we think we should always do that whenever we do empirical work? Probably not, because it shuts down our ability to learn from the data. Now, obviously, if you have a lot of time, then you could do some sequential process where you have one pre-analysis plan, then you see something else in the data, then you write another pre-analysis plan. But of course, you've already seen something in the data, so you'd need to get since you've already seen the data, you're not able to kind of rewrite that pre-analysis plan. Now, if the goal here is to just learn about relationships that exist in the world, then obviously you could then go and get a different data set, pre-register this observation you have from this particular variation, say I'm gonna do it this way in this other variation, and then go and do it that way, which would be maybe the equivalent of discovering in a drugs trial that this drug works particularly well on men, but you haven't pre-registered that heterogeneity, and then going and doing a new randomized controlled trial just on men and showing indeed it does work well. That you need to pull a new sample, and here you would also need to do the same.
Yeah, so I've seen actually that article that you referred to by some people affiliated with JPAL, where they're essentially calling for more flexibility in how we use both pre-registration and pre-analysis plans, as you said. So I think being aware of the goals is particularly important. So what I wanted to ask you is that I noticed that you serve on the editorial board for some journals in economics. So I assume that you see a lot of manuscripts, particularly with experiments. And I'm wondering what you think research in economics is doing particularly well when it comes to experiments, and what is it that other disciplines can take from this approach to experimentation and learn from it?
I think the thing we've been thinking a lot about in recent years, which I think other disciplines can learn from, is issues related to scalability, robustness of results, replicability. This comes to these questions of external validity, and we've learned a lot about that. Something experiments naturally cry out for replication, something which kind of natural experiments, it's very hard to replicate them. You need to find another natural experiment. if you're designing your experiment, you can just go and do it in some other country. You don't need to have to have found that they also had some unexpected death of some politician that led to a change in legislation or something like that. So I think that's an area where we've really pushed forward. Some things we've learned from that agenda is, things which work well on the micro scale often may not scale if you do them kind of nationally. Some of that is general equilibrium effects, which aren't at play often in a kind of initial pilot or a small scale experiment, but then start to matter when you scale these things up. Some of that work has been done by just massively scaling up government programs, for example. Other work has been done more structurally, and we can start to learn even if we don't have that massive experiment, although with the kind of caveats that are generally there for structural work. Another thing we've discovered is, often the first places where you do experiments have unusually high impacts, and that's for two reasons. Firstly, if you're naturally, if you're an economist, committing to spending several years often working on a experiment, you're not going to go to the place where you expect the treatment effect to be lowest. We're constrained by sample size. You're going to the place where this is a big problem and where people think this solution might be a good one, or a place where this mechanism you think is very relevant. And if you then go and repeat it, if the researcher was correct in finding the place where the treatment effects were largest, and in general they're heterogeneous, or this mechanism was most at play, then obviously you're going to find smaller effects as you move away from that location that they've chosen. The kind of second thing we've discovered is often, in practical terms, the implementing team is often best where you first do it. That could be because this is an NGO who's passionate about this particular program and they're really good at implementing it. Meanwhile, when you try and scale this up to the whole country, you're getting NGOs who haven't spent 5 years with this program attempting to take this program and implement it, and they're doing a less good job at implementing. They have less good staff, they're less good at whatever teaching the material or making mistakes in how they set things up. And then at the same time, you also often have academics who are, highly skilled individuals who are keeping an eye on things, maybe employing project managers as well, who are keeping an eye on what the NGO is doing and maybe giving additional insight there as well. So, that's another reason why we may find that the initial RCTs have larger effect sizes than elsewhere. But the thing that I think has been, we've learned a lot from is the value of scaling these things, the value of replicating them, etc. And there's whole organizations who just fund replications, and a lot of the donor money is now going to things that can be scaled and trying to think about scaling these things. And there's been a lot of work trying to kind of combine some of our general equilibrium thinking to kind of first, before a program is fully scaled, to try and think about what we expect might happen if you did fully scale it, and potentially adjust the program accordingly before the very costly full scale implementation. I think another thing more generally we can learn from kind of our approach to experiments is I get the sense that when we find a result from an experiment and then someone else does a similar experiment and finds a different result, we often update our priors. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's very important for science. In non-experimental approaches, I think that happens much less. Someone writes a structural model which comes to this conclusion. Someone shows that that was super sensitive to this Frechet distribution assumption, and in general, anything's happening with these particular models. No one reads that paper or cares, and people still believe the original structural model, even though it might have been 30 years ago, and it doesn't even hold up to kind of newer, kind of more flexible structural approaches or such like. So, you know, I think we're kind of better at updating our priors based on related experiments, just because I think we do you know, put more faith in the validity of a new experiment than you might put in the validity of a new structural exercise. And so you're more likely to just say, oh, well, I'm going to trust the one written by the famous people and not update your prior, when, you know, studies show that just a replication of that, but then changing a few parameters shows wildly different results. No one really cares. And so we still think in our head that, you know, that original result is something that we should take seriously when designing a policy, for example, or when thinking about mechanisms, when it might be just a kind of knife edge case or a very, very small part of the parameter space that isn't realistic.
That was super interesting. Thank you very much for sharing your insights, David.
Great, Sam. It was a pleasure.